Good afternoon and welcome to After Hours. Welcome to this beautiful spot. And joining me today is John Shayler. And honestly, I wasn't quite sure where to begin because, I haven't said who you are, but we're about to find out who you are.
Indeed we will.
But I was thinking about you yesterday. Normally on my days off, I listen to classical music, CBC, and of course there's a newscast. And I can't resist. I haven't read newspapers, watched the news for many moons. And it was about, part of the newscast was about the shooting, the little kids. And that was it. I started crying. I just broke down. And then yesterday, did I say this was yesterday? This was a week ago. And then yesterday, I had a day off, so I put on CBC and there was opera. But the news came on. But there was a turn in the story of these school kids being killed. And it was protest. And it was strong protest. No guns. Don't kill our kids. I thought of you, and I guess I just want your comment because we've had so many discussions, for example, at Kent State. Talk about your political awareness.
My political awareness. I think there's similarities where I got it from. Certainly TV, being a TV generation type. The two things that influenced me the most politically, I think, were the civil rights movements in the States and the Vietnam War. And those were because TV was still covering those fairly thoroughly.
And I think fairly honestly.
Yeah, Vietnam War, I think after that, the governments of the warring nations decided never again will we allow people such an insight into what war is and who we're actually killing. And I think, I think the idea when you talked about children and the school shootings, there were children being killed by the thousands in Vietnam through bombing and napalm. And the images that we saw back then, tweaked in me. I think there was always this idea with me around bullies. For some reason, at a very early age, I disliked bullies because someone tried to bully me very early on. And I stood up to him and he backed off. And when I saw political bullying or social bullying, it always raised hackles. So to me, the white cops were bullies in the civil rights movement.
Bullies, they killed their own.
Yeah. The American
people were very brave then. I guess that's what I sort of heard in the newscast. Very brave. They put their lives literally on the line to help. They even help other people. Talk a bit about that.
Well, that moved me. I mean, the whole idea, if people were willing to do that and get involved, then, I'm in a different situation, and it began to speak to me about getting involved, and that happened very slowly. I would write letters to the editor and things like that, wanting to. In Vancouver at that time, let's call them, and they still exist now, I call them developer bullies and speculator bullies. And things were really changing in Vancouver, and I think in the world when I first started to really get involved, not only having the consciousness that formed then about what I thought was unjust in the world, but also the idea of how I could speak to that. I had this inside me wanting to say something. So those would, be individual things. Eventually what happened is I got the courage, and being quite an introvert, to speak in public for me, and I know for a lot of people, speaking in public is one of the most horrific experiences you can present people with. Well, I decided to speak on an issue around the redevelopment of the north side of Falls Creek in the very early days at a public hearing at Vancouver City Council.
Were you part of an organization or anything?
No, I was John Shayler. Yes. And And John Shayler went up with his written stuff, you know, shaking.
Yeah.
There were about 500 people there in the setting, and I read it and got through it. And afterwards, I was approached by Jim Green, who was then the new organizer for the Downtown Eastside Residents Association, and he said that he liked what I had to say, and I was happy with that. And would I like to get involved in issues in the Downtown East Side? And I knew the Downtown East Side from growing up, and I thought, well, sure, I'll get involved. And you know, all the time as well, I was also going to post-secondary education. I'd quit school at 15. But I'd gone back as an adult learner when I was in my late teens into my early 20s, and eventually found my way to Langara College. But the American-based SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, were on campus then, and I would go to their talks, and I would read.
Stimulate you.
Yes, I was also reading things like the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Oh yes.
And various things, and so that was all in the background happening. But this was my first involvement, and it happened in. Well, it first happened in my union, but we can maybe get back to that. But
let's talk about DERA, Downtown Eastside Residents Association.
Yes.
Because they did a lot in the Downtown East Side.
Yes, and the Downtown Eastside Residents Association was formed in 1973, before I was involved, by a number of people. Some will recognize the names. Bruce Erickson and his partner, very young at the time, Libby Davies.
Talk a bit about Bruce Erickson, because he was unique, unusual.
He was a very unique man. He was gruff. You know, he was a rough jewel in the organizing end of things in the community. He came from the same place my dad came from, which is the north end of Winnipeg.
Oh.
And my dad, I think, had a grade 5 education. He's about 10 years older, and Bruce Erickson had a grade 4 education. And he worked very early in life and got a job at a very young age, 13 or 14, on the ships, and was involved in the Canadian Seamen's Union and all that kind of things. But he was a hard-living guy, and he at one time struggled with alcohol. And
did he not live in the downtown?
Yeah, he lived in a hotel. Yeah. And looked around him, and Libby Davies' father was a social planner. And this is when, 72, there was what would be called in Canada a number of reform councils. They weren't the old developer-friendly. These were going to be city councils that were more liberal, more progressive. I think that was the years Harry Rankin first got on, and people who know Vancouver would know Harry Rankin. But Bruce Erickson was brought into a meeting about the Downtown East Side and what could help improve it, because to the rest of the world at that time, it wasn't known as the Downtown East Side. It was known as Skid Road.
Yes.
Now don't confuse that with Skid Row in the States. Skid Road was a historical name. Which was in Vancouver when the
I thought everybody had Skid Row.
No, Skid Row. Skid Road was a historical name given to the area at one time, because when they were clearing the town site and clearing just outside of the town site, say at what's now Main and Hastings, they would skid the logs down a road made of logs. So that was the Skid Row down into the inlet.
Oh, that's interesting. There's another part of that, I think, is that's where the City Hall used to be and stuff, isn't that where the
City Hall
really started?
Yeah, that was the central part of the city, yeah. City Hall had 2 locations there. One of them was close to the Carnegie Center at one time, which was built in 1902. The town site was around the Gastown area, but the thing was that Bruce Erickson basically said, if you want to do anything good, don't have people do things for the Downtown East Side. What we need is a residents association that would be resident-based, almost on the design of a union. So Downtown Eastside Residents Association started with a group of people, including Bruce, that had an executive. They called themselves an executive, like a union executive. And people who joined who were residents in the areas, mostly single men at that time still.
I think a lot of the people who lived there were like loggers and miners and that kind of thing.
There were former resource industries, and people will maybe not know that the whole design of the hotels and rooming houses were that there was a bar at the bottom. There were rooms at the top that basically quite often they didn't often have a cooking, a hot plate, bathroom down the hall for 10 rooms. And the people who lived there in the early days of the city and right up till the 40s or 30s or 40s were resource industry workers who would come back into town from logging or fishing or whatever the case was and live in those rooms. And the bars were where they socialized, but they were also hiring halls. So the Vancouver bar situation is different than many other places in Canada because it was a resource industry town, and that's where people got their houses.
It was a community.
That's right. So
I don't know if it is so much anymore, but I know even when I was there, very much it was a community.
Yeah. And this was the thing that Bruce and other people that came after, including me, spent a lot of time doing, convincing people that it wasn't a skid road or a skid row where there were just a lot of people would get their impression about the neighborhood from going by on a bus or a streetcar in the old days, and people would be coming out of bars and they'd be drunk. So the idea was everyone who lived in the area was, a drunk or a bum or all those things.
Homeless, whatever.
So that was the stereotype of the area, and Bruce said that basically what we want to do is to change the name of it. So he basically set out along with Libby and Gene Swanson and other people who wanted to say to the community, when you read the headlines that a man has been stabbed in the downtown east side, look at the details, because 80% of the drinking establishments in the entire city are located there. So people come there to have their fun, and they get drunk and they fight. And so if you read the fine print, the guy who got stabbed lived in New Westminster, and the guy who stabbed him lived in Surrey. So it was a gravitational pull for people to drink there. Now, who were the residents? That was the argument. The residents were a lot of men at that time, mostly older. People who had passed, including I knew a lot of the guys when I went into the hotels when I worked for DERA. And they were guys who had been in the Second World War. Some of them were disabled from war. Some of them were ex-resource workers. Some weren't. Most of them were low income because that was the cheapest place in town to live. Some of the characters had been not only through the Second World War, but had fought Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and were onto Ottawa Trek, which an interview you did recently talked about. And these were people with real histories, and they were being covered over with this idea that they were just a bunch of bums and throwaways. You still have that idea about the neighborhood, is that people who live there are somehow not human, whereas there are people with rich histories and different histories who have fallen on hard times. And
could be any one of us.
But there was community, and we used to argue, and I used to do a lot of workshops and go to the School of Social Work and take politicians on walkabouts and explain to them that the people who lived there, it was a stable population, especially before Expo and the Expo evictions. But it was a stable population, and it had the most stable, second most stable population in the city next to Dunbar.
That's
more stable than Shaughnessy, more stable than all those. So people had lived there a long time. The alcohol rate of the people who actually live in the area was not any higher than anywhere else in the city, even though people would get their impressions from the streets. So the whole idea of DERA was not only to change the name and the attitudes towards the downtown east side, rename it the downtown east side as an actual neighborhood where people were connected and looked after each other, but also fight for things that people took for granted in their own neighborhoods, like a community center.
Carnegie. What was your role quickly at DERA?
Yeah.
And then continue on with that.
I had various roles at DERA. Sometimes I was paid, sometimes the money ran out on grants and I was volunteer. But whatever I was doing there was generally around supporting the organizer at the time, Jim Green, who was new to the job. And I used to sit across from him and, we would have discussions about strategy and things like that. And there were other people that had significant roles there. And that's the problem with the great man theory of history, is that all sorts of people get left out. So, for example, Sue Harris had a job of making sure that the bars were not over-serving. So they'd get a person and they would be so drunk they couldn't sit up, but they would continue to take money off the table and over-serve them.
Yeah.
And also to deal with the thing that has gone on forever in the Downtown Eastside is that landlords who, we called slum landlords, we would give an award every year, the Cockroach Award, for the landlord who was the worst.
The worst place.
And this was the idea. The bars, they would make money off the bars. They'd take it all out of the community and they would put no money back into the housing. So over the decades, the housing just continued to deteriorate. So there was a fight for the city enforcing the standards of maintenance bylaws. And that was a big thing with Bruce and Libby and the others and Jean, is that every year, and I remember as a kid reading the Sun newspaper in the late 50s and early 60s when I was doing that, you would always hear about rooming house and hotel fires where people would die, 17, 20 a year at least, because there were no sprinklers and the exits were boarded up or there was no fire escape. This was the idea that people in this area didn't matter and deserved rights. So you're fighting on the rights end of things. The Carnegie Community Center is probably one of the best illustrations because it was for many years the museum for the city, the main museum.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right?
I didn't know that.
And as things moved away from the Downtown Eastside over the decades, business went up Granville Street, and as it developed elsewhere in the city, the Downtown Eastside got neglected. Mm-hmm. And politicians, when they think that the people there don't vote for you, and they're particular politicians, they don't give a damn what's happening there. Mm-hmm. So DERA began to raise voices around this, like, why don't we have a community center? The people here are people and they deserve the same thing. And it was boarded up. The Carnegie Center had closed, and that beautiful building had nothing going on there for quite a number of years. So for 7 years,
it's a hub.
Yeah, for 7 years, the people at DERA then, that's before my time, fought, lobbied, demonstrated to turn it into a community center. There were plans to rip it down, which is Vancouver's well known for ripping down really great buildings. And the other one was to turn it into a recreation center for the Vancouver police. But no idea of a community center. And then finally, when the community center looked like it was going to happen, there was a city councillor, I won't venture a name because I'm not sure if it's the right one, said in a debate, I can tell you the party, the NPA, which had been in power since 1936. And they were a developer-friendly group. And they basically, this particular councillor said, there's no need to have a community center down there. In fact, having one would be like pouring money down a sewer. So that was the general political view. So you can see why people who were fighting for those things could get a little bit angry.
Upset?
Yes. Anyway, someone else, when the library was brought up, it might have been the mayor at the time, I don't remember, basically said, why have a library in there? Because people down there don't read.
Really interesting, because that center has been used.
It opened in 1980, and the first day there were 2,000 people that passed through, and it became the busiest community center in the city.
Of course, because that,
So that activism at the time, that pushing for, the most basic rights and to rename the area and say, we're here and we're human beings, we might have different lives than you, but we're going to fight for it. And that for me was a wonderful place to walk into, because we were doing things that I thought were essential, that were right.
Well, and DERA started and helped a lot of permanent housing there. Good housing.
Yeah, when I was there, we had a housing arm. I wasn't involved in that. That was mostly Jim Green and a number of other people, Joanne Hoshu, Stephen Leary, a bunch of people who their names aren't as big, but did a lot of work at that time. And we created, through that housing society, 600 units of non-market housing at a time when that funding from the federal government was drying up. And the idea was it was a race against, it was either we were going to replace that bad housing that some of the SROs, single room occupancies, had turned into. And we knew that if that housing wasn't replaced, there was going to be a gigantic increase in homelessness. Mm-hmm. And those warnings went, there was no attention given to those warnings. And eventually that's what's happened to Vancouver, is that I think there were something like 12,000 residents who lived in those kind of housing units. So approximately 10,000 SROs in the Downtown Eastside and down Granville, which had similar demographics, the hotels in Granville Street, is that those places housed the people where there was no social safety net for housing underneath it. And our idea was this wasn't the housing we wanted to keep, but we needed to replace it with better housing, self-contained housing. But we were losing the race, and we lost the race, especially with Expo, with 1,000 people being evicted in 6 weeks.
It's interesting because the whole, I haven't been there for a long time, but I think the whole nature started changing. Even when I was in the neighborhood, I used to be able to sit in Pigeon Park. There was more, I think, of a native community.
Yeah, there were.
And I think part of that, I just recently read a book, Five Little Indians, an excellent book to read. It really tells the story of residential schools. And they were dropped off. 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds were dropped off with, I don't know, a quarter or $5 in the Downtown Eastside. That's why there was such a native population.
Yeah. When you ask me what my job was, just to get back to that, I did everything around. I used to go in Monday mornings and clean the offices because we couldn't afford to,
hire somebody.
Well, there were cockroaches in the drawers, and where we were at Carroll and Hastings, right at 9 East Hastings, and I used to go and wash the floors, clean the bathrooms, because it was a nice physical job, and I didn't mind doing that. I also did a lot of the educational stuff where I would go out to planning schools or whatever and talk to students about the neighborhood and try to dispel the stereotypes of the neighborhoods that say this is a real community and these are the issues that are happening there. And this is what DERA has done over the years.
How do people respond to that?
Very well. I remember doing some at high schools, Handsworth High, which is close to West Van, and I remember finishing it. It was a slideshow, that was the top technology of the time. And I finished the slideshow, and this very shy young student came up to me afterwards, and he said, "Thank you very much."
Wow.
Yeah. Because,
rewarding.
Yeah, well, it was eye-opening to people that that the neighborhood has this disparaging overlay, which is handy politically because you can and if you look at that area for years, the gambling places, at one time the opium places when it was a Chinese area, especially near Shanghai Alley and all that. The good burghers of the town, the ones who became mayor and the ones who worked for the CPR, where do you think they would want things like that? They're all up Alexander Street. There were brothels, and some of them, I think, some of those old buildings, if they're still there, used to have the name of the madam who ran it in that very nice, I forget what you call that stuff, where you tiles.
Boy, times have changed.
But you see, when you have a part of the city where you want to go have fun yourself and see women of the night, so to speak, you don't want it to be if you live in Shaughnessy in your neighborhood. So everything was dumped there.
Right.
So the residents were basically saying enough. We're not going to be a dumping ground. We want to be seen as citizens like everyone else with rights. Yeah.
What about the Woodwards Building? That was a big thing. I know, but I don't want to mention Jim's name all the time.
Yeah.
But I think it was a big deal for him.
I think it was
everybody.
It was a personal thing for Jim. With me, it was personal as well from my longevity in the city, because I used to go down on the streetcar with my grandmother, and Woodwards was the heart of the city. It had a wonderful food market, and the old guys who used to live in the hotels and rooming houses, they would go down there. Some of them still wore fedoras at that time, and they would go down there and they would be treated really well. The servers at that time would be older women, and the ones who would call you dear. Yeah. And they would call these old guys dears, and they knew all their names, and so there was that real infrastructure as well for people who live in the hotels and rooming houses, because they needed places to eat and a place to get a cup of coffee. They had low incomes, but they kept the area going. And Woodwards was from 1904 at that location. Right up until it closed in the 70s, was a real beacon of activity down there. And when it was boarded up, that was part and parcel of the area that was now surrounded by mega projects, the redevelopment of the north side of Falls Creek, Yaletown, and all that. So what's happening is what you see in the city now is you get a rezoning of the north side of Falls Creek, and all the property values outside of it into the downtown east side also rose.
Right.
So
dominoes.
So things that, like, from 1980, when Bill Bennett, who was the premier, social credit premier at the time, when he announced the stadium down there and the development to happen on BC Place, that was part of my work to document what we were losing as far as housing. In 2 years, we lost 2,000 units. And some of them were just torn down and turned into parking lots. Well, the same thing happened to the infrastructure in the downtown east side, is the shops that couldn't afford the rents anymore closed. So you may remember this, at a certain point of time, the area looked like a Western ghost town. In the early 80s and through the 80s and after Expo. And if you walked down there, it was scary then because there was no street life.
Yes.
Right?
See, I used to sit in Pigeon Park, and I remember they had people coming up and
very friendly,
sitting with me, very friendly, and don't worry, nobody will hurt you or anything, It was like a...
Yes. I was asked to do interviews every once in a while from the TV media at the time around issues, and they would always want to shoot somewhere, topical like Pigeon Park, and I'd say, well, if you don't mind being interrupted a lot, then do it there, because eventually someone will walk up and say, so what's going on in the middle of the interview? Yeah, it was always really interesting. But no, that was again, Woodwards was, once that closed down, that was part of a whole closing down of the businesses, the loss of housing, the rise of homelessness. All of those businesses in those old, maybe 1910, 1920 buildings along Hastings Street, all those places were owned by numbered companies. We couldn't even get an idea of who they were. And that began the speculation and the loss of housing in the downtown east side. And one of the big nails in the coffin was the Expo evictions, where we tried desperately, and I worked with the social planning department with Glenn Bullard, to draft an anti-eviction no rent increase bylaw for the downtown east side residents, because it didn't matter how long you lived in a hotel. Some lived in the same one for 40 years. There was a guy in the Patricia who lived there for 40 years, paid his rent every month, lived there by the month, but had no status as a tenant. So they were not covered by the Residential Tenancy Act. They were seen as hotel guests.
You worked for Truck.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And so they could be evicted little bit, a lot of people know that they could be evicted or would be evicted immediately. So when Expo came around, we said, oh God, these people have to be protected or we're going to have a major, problem, catastrophe here. So we tried to run that by city council, but people like Gordon Campbell and others said, nah, it's not going to happen. And we said, well, if it's not going to happen, then approve the bylaw, then it won't happen.
Right.
And they never did approve the bylaw that I worked with social planning to come up with, which would have been a short-term thing to protect people during the fair 6 months. And Jimmy Pattison, we had him in the office and tried to convince him, and no from Jimmy either, he wouldn't do anything about it. And thousand residents, many seniors, many disabled, were evicted in 6 weeks. And I don't think the neighborhood recovered. And I call those, given the housing crisis we're in now and given my work with TRAC, one of the things that I used to say about it is that the people in the downtown east side are the canary in the coal mine. That if people are going to be evicted here, then, everyone said, well, it's too bad poor people are being kicked out, but, I'm okay.
It's them.
Yeah.
It's always them.
And that was the beginning of that kind of speculation. And in the post-Expo years, it really picked up. And I was working for DERA up till '88, and then I became the coordinator for the Tenants' Rights Coalition. And that's very much in keeping with what's going on, not only in Vancouver,
everywhere,
but spilling over onto this island as well, where property values here have now gone up immeasurably, and people are speculating on property. People see property now as an investment, and whether they like it or not, my view is that places are to live in. I never owned a house until I was almost 70, right? I rented all that time, but I see my house as a place to live. I don't want a place where I'm just, putting my money into. At one time in Vancouver, that kind of speculation on housing was unheard of. Sometimes
hard to imagine.
And a lot of people say it's foreign money, and I'm always careful with that because I've chaired housing coalitions in years past, and people want to blame people from other places. I call it non-resident money. Right. So that money comes from anywhere. Some of it, of course, came from Asia, especially after Hong Kong.
All over the world.
After Hong Kong changed hands. That money was looking for somewhere, but at one time, to put that into residential property would have been unheard of. Now that kind of investment in real estate is actually bigger than the stock market.
So here you are on Main Island, small world, and I see you as I'm doing a mop, and it's like, I know you from somewhere. And I think I did guess the place, DERA. And we've had many interesting conversations, which we just got a snippet of it on today.
Indeed.
And we were talking because I see people who do the kind of work you've done as political activists, and you said, oh, no, I'm a community activist. But I think you've changed your mind, or you've thought about it.
I used to say I was a community worker.
Oh, that's right.
Yes. It was my wrestling with the term activist, and in your interview with Joey Hartman, she said that she was a union activist and took on that mantle with pride, and I think she should, because she did the work and consequently can be called an activist. When I went into the Downtown East Side, I was not a resident of the Downtown East Side, so I saw myself as in a helping role, bringing whatever I had to it, and I thought that a name such as activist was a little too glorified for me. Also, we didn't call ourselves activists back then. We used to call ourselves organizers, community organizers. There's much in a title, and activism has always been, especially now when I think about it, I think there are all sorts of people that can use it, say I'm an activist, because they've done the work. And I feel I've done the work, so I'll take it now. But the idea is that a lot of people call themselves activists and they've done really not much. So people who want to sound important will say, I'm a political activist, and maybe they've been involved in one demonstration or they post on Facebook. It's not one of those.
It's the grassroots foundation.
Yeah, and I saw myself as a worker, someone there who was working with people who lived in the neighborhood to bring forward these issues and to work on these issues, and that was fine for me. Now, I guess with my resume, I could probably join Joey and say, well, I've done the work. I can say I've been an activist, sure. I've been called that in a pejorative way in the newspaper. People say John Shayler, Downtown Eastside activist, but you can always read the tone in it.
Yeah.
Trying to dismiss you as someone who just wants to run for political office and doesn't really care about the issue.
And about the people.
Yeah, I mean, that was something the mayor at the time, Gordon Campbell, used to use a lot. John Shayler's just talking about these things because he wants to get elected. And I used to think that's strange coming from someone who's been elected. And I've never run for anything. So anyway, yeah, I was glad you brought that up because I've really thought about that. And watching Joey's interview, it sort of said to me, yeah, I can call myself a community activist now.
Well, we've run out of time, but we're going to spend more time talking.
It sounds lovely.
Yes, and
Yeah.
you have so much information. I'm going to start bugging you about writing the history.
Yes, I've been bugging myself for 3 years. I have a working title. It's called An Accidental Activist and the Issues That Changed the Face of Vancouver. So watch for it on the bookshelf.
All right. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Patrice.
Thank you, John, for doing this. We're going to have many more discussions. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Joey, for this lovely space that worked out so perfect.